And thank you again for joining us for Before Erie, Maryland Susquehanna River Canals. Dr. Jim Gibb will be our speaker tonight, and my name is Allison. I work for St. Mary's County Library.
Now it's perfect. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the end of the 2023 season of these talks. I'm talking about canals tonight, and specifically, I'm going to focus on some canal lock excavations that the Archaeological Society of Maryland did some years ago. Exactly when, I don't recall. But we'll get to that. There'll be two other talks this year, October and November. October is going to be on that fascinating subject of making bricks. It may not sound terribly interesting, but I think you will find it interesting to see how bricks were actually made, particularly in the colonial era. And then November, we're going to talk about some new research just completed. The report was done this weekend on a 5,000-year-old Native American site near Waldorf in Charles County. So, without any more to do here, let's talk about canals. There was a war between Philadelphia and Baltimore in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It wasn't a shooting war, so far as I know, but it was a contest between these two cities which could garner the produce of the interiors of Maryland and Pennsylvania. These cities would bring in produce from rural areas and process it and ship it. And whoever got the lion's share of that interior produce got the lion's share of the wealth. So these two cities, and remember, Baltimore was quite young in the 18th century. It had just started forming in the mid-18th century. It wasn't much to talk about just yet, whereas Philadelphia had been around since the late 17th century. So I brought up just to show you, this is from a pamphlet that somebody had published in 1771. And I'll read it for you, because it's a good introduction to what I'm going to talk about. That Baltimore town in Maryland has within a few years, isn't that interesting? They had to point out that Baltimore is in Maryland. And this is out of Philadelphia. Has within a few years past carried off from this city, Philadelphia, almost the whole of the trade of Frederick, York, Bedford, and Cumberland counties. It is a fact of general notoriety. Its situation on the west side of the river Susquehanna and vicinity to those counties will always be a prevailing inducement with the inhabitants of those parts to resort to Baltimore for trade, rather than be at the expense of crossing the river Susquehanna and afterwards to drag their wagons along a road rendered almost impassable by the multitude of carriages which use it. And it goes on. And basically, what this person is doing is proposing a canal to facilitate transportation of produce, particularly wheat. Also, wood ash, potash, all sorts of things. So the canal that we actually did some excavation on with the Archaeological Society of Maryland, particularly the Northern Society, the northern chapter of that organization. The Susquehanna Canal was along what we would call the north side of the Susquehanna, or east side. And one of the ways they planned to fund it was, as was often the case in the 18th and early 19th centuries, is they would have a public lottery, and people would buy lottery tickets, and there would be prizes, and whatever money was left over went to whatever that particular cause would be. I actually did the math on this, and I mean, you look at the prizes here, the two first prizes are $20,000 each. And there's almost 7,000 prizes they'd be giving out. When I did the math, it came to $140,000. Well, the lottery would have only raised, I think, $150,000. So they're really going to make $10,000 out of this. but money went a lot longer, further than it does now. In 1799, a map maker created this map, and I've highlighted the canal with these red arrows. This is proposed. It had not actually opened at this point. The Susquehanna Canal would not open until 1803. And I've used very subtly two different colors for the arrows at the two extremes, the top right, lower left, and then the two middle ones, which have more of a pinkish fill. The canal, the whole idea of this canal was only about 9 miles long, was to get around the rapids of the Susquehanna River. And that's how a lot of canals worked in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They didn't parallel the entire length of a river. They tended, the canal companies would use the river as far as they could. And when they hit shallow, rocky areas, like along the fall line, where we switched from Piedmont to coastal plain, they would put in a canal to circumvent those rocks. And that's what you see here. In doing so, however, they'd had to cross creeks. So there's a creek here, and there's a creek down here, and that required aqueducts. Also, and I'll get into this a little bit later, they're dealing with topography, and they're kind of moving downslope. They're going across some steep slopes. Well, if your canal just follows the slopes, then it's going to be a little better than the river. It's going to have rapids. It's going to flow too quickly. And so they installed locks. And a lock is essentially like a step ladder that helps canal boats go down or up, depending on which way they're going on the canal. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Now, here's Havre de Grace, which is up at the northern part of the bay. The town would be right here. It was badly damaged during the War of 1812 by the British. But it's on this north or east bank that the canal, that they had planned to have the canal come down to Havre de Grace to the end of the Susquehanna River and effectively the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay. This is a bathymetric map. Look at those numbers there, 24, 34. Those are fairly deep, but there's a lot of small numbers in here. There's a channel running up along the west bank, but a lot of shallow water, especially once you get out in the bay. Compare that to Baltimore, one piece of Baltimore. These are much deeper waters you're looking at, 8, 10, 11 feet, as towards the shallow end, 28, 25 feet. Baltimore was a natural harbor. It had deep water, which was suitable for large vessels to come in. Whereas Havre de Grace, you're up at the northern end of the bay. There's a lot of sediment that was coming down the Susquehanna and the Great and Little Big Elk and Little Elk rivers. And so the waters were much shallower there, lots of shoals. Not ideal. Baltimore really was ideal and continues to be for marine traffic. So the Susquehanna Canal, again, ran down the east bank or north bank, depending on what part of the river you're on at that particular point, because it heads kind of northwesterly and then northward. But it was also called the Conowingo Canal because it more or less originated where the Conowingo Dam is today. It was called the Octoraro because that was one of the principal creeks it crossed. Port Deposit, which was its southern terminus, and it was also called the Maryland Canal. It was chartered in 1783, but you always have to, those kinds of dates, they tend to be aspirational, where these corporations come together. And remember, this is early in our history when people were very leery of corporations. They hated corporations. Our founding fathers hated corporations. So in order to form any kind of corporation, you had to have the General Assembly in Maryland pass a law recognizing that corporation. So we have a group of people getting together in 1783 to get the General Assembly to charter that corporation. But it wasn't until years later that construction actually began. It opened in 1803. The company sold out in 1817, and the canal was effectively closed by 1840. So it wasn't that long lived, although, I don't know, 40 years is not bad for a bit of infrastructure. It ran from Port Deposit, which is pretty much at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, up to Octoraro Creek and beyond to Conowingo. It had 3 sets of locks. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit in a few minutes. It was only about 9 miles long, and that's because its purpose was to get around the shoals, get around the falls around Conowingo. It wasn't terribly well designed in the sense that it was considered too shallow to accommodate conventional canal boats. And the problem is, a canal boat is a fairly large, heavy vessel. And if you load it up with inland commodities, especially coal, and these canals really started carrying mostly coal by the mid-19th century. So that's a heavy load. So these things are going to be low in the water. You need fairly deep water to sustain them. The Maryland Canal was succeeded by the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal, which was built on the opposite side of the river. The Susquehanna Canal, you can see, so the North Shore on this map, there's nothing shown there. On the South Shore, you can see the Susquehanna Canal coming all the way down. It was chartered in 1836, again, required an act of the General Assembly. It closed in 1894, completed in 1840 from Havre de Grace, again, near the top of the bay, up to Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, so across the state boundary. 29 locks, 43 miles, spanning 230 feet in elevation. And again, we'll get back to how these locks work in a moment. Most of these, well, let's say, face it, all these canals eventually were superseded by railroads. And railroads started coming in around 1840. So those canals started around 1800, 1820. They really garnered the market. I mean, they were carrying a lot of inland trade out to these major cities. And the case of these canals to Baltimore. These canals would take the produce to the upper end of the Chesapeake, and from there you just boat down to Baltimore, where that stuff would be sold for domestic use or put on board ships and sent around the world. But railroads were the major competitor to canals starting around 1840. Other major canals at the time, the Potomac Canal, again, it was a short canal, actually a series of short canals designed to circumvent the falls above Washington, D.C. But people, by and large, used the river for transportation. The Erie Canal, of which we're all familiar, was started in 1817. It was completed in 1825. It basically ran down the Mohawk Valley. It took vessels from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean by way of the Hudson River. And you can still see the canal today. It's still open. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal basically linked the Chesapeake and Delaware bays, completed in 1829. It has been greatly expanded and is still used today. And then, of course, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal running from essentially Washington, D.C. up to Cumberland, Maryland, completed 1850, closed 1924. So it was completed about the time the railroads are really starting to kick in. And as a result, a lot of the loads carried on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal were bulk commodities like coal, probably still grain, maybe some other lime, the lime kilns. I found this map on the internet from Pennsylvania. And if you look closely in the smallest font, such as I'm circling with my mouse here, these are a whole bunch of small canals throughout, particularly the east and southern parts of the state. Pennsylvania had a strong engineering history. A lot of works done there with railroads as well as canals. First inclined plane that took canal boats over the mountains, developed in Pennsylvania. But most of those canals were short ones, again, to get over some rough ground. So the canal work I'm going to talk about this evening is from the Maryland Canal or Octoraro Canal on the north side or west or east side of the Susquehanna. This is a LiDAR image that shows Maryland 222 that runs from Rising Sun, Conowingo area down to, I guess that's Perryville on the north side, but effectively down to Havre de Grace. And you can see, although this canal closed in 1840, you can still see in the LiDAR image the canal, including where the three locks were located. One of the things that really interested me about this canal, I can't even remember who introduced, well, I guess I ran into it when we were doing an archaeology project up there on a Aboriginal site dating back to the late Archaic transitional era. And part of the canal ran right through our project area. But you could see these locks here. The canal comes in on a east-southeasterly trajectory. Then it does a 90-degree turn for these locks, and then it does another 90-degree turn. And I thought that was really strange because you've got this water flowing. You don't like, engineers don't like those kinds of turns when dealing with water or with railroads. You like to have sort of gradual curves. And it makes maintenance a lot easier. You don't have to worry quite so much about erosion. But it does show up quite clearly on LiDAR, even though it's been gone for a long time. Now, the way locks work, you usually have some sort of spillway, some way of taking water around the locks, just to sort of manage water when you have high water. But you basically create this caisson, this closed bit of canal with gates. And in those gates, you trap water. So water flows in along with the canal boat. When, let's say, we have at the lower pond end, you've got these gates here, and they're closed. You open up these gates to let water flow in from the high end, fill this thing up like a bathtub. And so the canal boats are coming in through that gate into that high water. You then close the gate behind, keep any more water from flowing in. And then at the bottom of the gates downstream, you have these little louvered doors that you open up that lets the water out. So it's sort of like unplugging a bathtub. So the water empties out into that lower pound, and the boat lowers along with it. And then the gates open, you push, you get people pushing the gate open, the boat goes out, and maybe another one coming upstream can go back in, low water, close the gate behind, open this end here so water pours in, fills up like a bathtub, canal boat rises, open that gate, and it can continue upstream. There is a tow path, and when a canal boat approached a lock, the mules would be removed from the boat. They remove the reins and just sort of push the canal boat in, and the mules would continue down the tow path and hook up once the canal boat reached the lower end. And below, you can see this thing sort of in profile, how it works. But it's just, if you think in terms of a bathtub, except the water's coming in one end and going out the other. We have, this was considered really, sophisticated engineering in the late 18th and 19th centuries. As a result, there are a lot of drawings that survive. So this is a pair of locks on the Erie Canal. The drawing was done in 1840. And it's a pair, so you can have vessels, it's sort of like a divided highway. So you can have some vessels going downstream, some going upstream at the same time. And here's another view. These are at Lockport, which is on the Erie Canal. And you can see this is the locks in profile. And it's basically a staircase. You can see it in plan view below. But it really is a staircase that allows the canals to go uphill and downhill. Clever, but labor intensive to build these things. And of course, maintenance, because you have to make sure you've always got water flowing into the canal. And that could be a problem when you have feeder canals that break down or, spring a leak or whatever. So managing the water was always a challenge with these things. So here's a couple of photographs from, I think this is from the C&O Canal, but this is at the downstream side. This is this kind of door that lets the water out before you open up the gates to allow the canal boat to descend. And this is, that would be in this what's on the left would be on the bottom and actually below water line when the lock is full of these gates down here. And then here you have a canal boat. We have no idea what cargo it's carrying because it all seems to be inside. But you can see they've got a tarp set up over the top. Canal boat operators effectively lived on the boat, cooked on the boat, did everything on it. And they did carry, some of them carried passengers. So the part of the canal I first saw was on this elongated bit of shoreline here between the floodplain and the Susquehanna River. And you can see there's a railroad that was running right alongside. And the highway here, this is Route 222. And you can see from topography, this is the route of the canal. It isn't marked on the topographic map as such, which is interesting. If you look at a map, this is from 2022, if they don't mark something like that, it means they're not recognizing it as being active. And that's kind of obvious with 2022, but as we look at some of the earlier maps, that suggests whether this thing's active or not. You see the Conowingo Dam up here. If you all have not crossed the Conowingo Dam, if you have a reason to head up north, rather than taking the expensive $9 toll bridge across the Susquehanna, you can go upstream. I think that's 155, but you could take this route that goes to this charming little town called Darlington and go across the 1920s Conowingo Dam. And it takes you out in Conowingo, and then you can just take 222 down to Perryville. And so it's a little out of the way, but it's only, half a dozen miles at most. And there's no toll for the Conowingo Dam. And it is quite scenic. So it's worth the trip if you're not in a rush. There's Octoraro Creek here, a sort of meandering creek that comes in, and the town of Octoraro. And where I put these blue crosses or arrows, that's where the locks are located. That's where the canal comes into those locks and out again. And there would have been an aqueduct that took the canal over the Octoraro Creek. And I have an image towards the end showing what one of those aqueducts look like. They don't survive on this canal. In 1858, we have the Martinet map, and it says Maryland here and canal down here. So the canal is actually mapped in. It crosses Octoraro Creek and continues down to Perryville. You'll notice right where it crosses Octoraro Creek, there's the canal company office, and there's some other buildings. So, some of these canal companies made a little bit of money on the side by renting out portions of the canal to millers. Sawmills and grist mills could actually use the canals as water power. We don't have any good archaeological evidence of that on the canal so far, but I'm pretty sure there was a sawmill somewhere around the Octoraro. It goes right by Rowlandsville, which is off the road. You can't see it from 222. You could drive through it. It's a very small place, but it's a sort of charming place to stop on the way. Darlington, Rowlandsville, and Perryville are both interesting places to stop on a kind of a day trip. So down here, Shore and Brothers, right along the canal near this island here. That's probably some sort of storehouse, warehouse. So there are a number of businesses that were built along these canals, typically on canal company property. And as with railroads, canal companies were hit by a lot of resistance from landowners who, their land was being taken from them. and they were given rather a modest amount of money for it because a canal right away might be 100 feet wide, going across the length of the property. So it turned out to be a lot of acreage. And commissions were often set up to hear their complaints and award damages. But typically, people did not get, landowners did not get anything out of the process because the canal company could say, and accurately so, that their land was worth a lot more money now if there was a canal or a railroad that ran through it. And it might have posed, might have locked, it might have made it difficult to get to land on the other side. But the argument was, well, your land's worth more now. Now, this map dates to 1858. So as far as we know, the Maryland Canal was defunct by then. But still, it was clearly a feature. There were still companies along it. I think perhaps we need to do some more research on the history of the canal and just see if portions of it weren't still operating. And it's odd that it should show up on a map of the state. This is just a detail of the same map. But again, you can see canal companies, so they had their own offices and probably storehouses here. And there would be other buildings, other businesses and dwellings associated with the canal. Thomas Jeffrey, we actually found his site archaeologically alongside the canal, and that's actually another house site right near it. And then we have the Lake Griffin and Stevenson map of 1877, I think it is. And take a look. There's the railroad, and there's a road alongside, but there's no canal indicated. And so again, that tells us that, 1877, that canal was not in operation. And it comes out, it's not Perryville, it comes down the Port Deposit, which again is an interesting little town to visit. In the Callahan map of 1863, you can see the Susquehanna replacement canal running along the west or south side of the river. I don't think any archaeological work has been done on that canal at all. And the same year, we have a U.S. Army map, again, that shows that Susquehanna Canal. A local historian, Bob Hostetter, put together this kind of sketch map of the canals and of the river. In the center, we have Conowingo Dam, and I have a couple of pictures I'll show you about under construction. But you can see he's drawn the canal from up around Love Island, down along the bank, across Conowingo Creek, where there are 3 locks and a sawmill. Continues down along the river, another 3 locks, which is at Octoraro Creek, although, yeah, that's on the right side, and an office. And it continues down to just above Port Deposit, but at the end of the rocks, at a point where the water starts getting deeper and it's navigable. And there's 3 locks there. So each of these sets of locks help take canal boats down significant changes in elevation. I found this image, I thought of, there's a, let's say here, it's Ohio, Rome, Buffalo. I don't know what that's all about. I don't know which canal this is, but you can see in this kind of romantic vision, except for the shacks on one side. But you can see this is the gate that this guy, he's not just leaning there smoking a pipe or something. He's using his legs and his back to push this lever that opens up the gate that allows the boat to then descend. This is a photograph taken, I don't know how many years ago, a black and white photograph, but this is the lock, one of the 3 locks at Octoraro Creek. And you can see how it's heavily overgrown. There are trees coming. The lock, even though supposedly this canal was not operating after 1840, so for 180 years, it's just been sitting there. But it's not stable. It is deteriorating. It was deteriorating partly because of these trees. The trees would go up, grow up, and apply lateral pressure to these walls, and they begin to fall apart. This is that lock. Again, this is the uppermost of three locks that go down to the Susquehanna, towards the Susquehanna River, which would be in the background. And at this point, the Archaeological Society of the Northern Chesapeake had done a lot of clearing. This was all overgrown with saplings and vines. It was just nasty. And this is it at a later stage, and I've cleaned it up. So this is a pretty impressive piece of construction. And you get a better sense of these things when you go visit the C&O Canal, for instance, where we've got preserved locks. The National Park Service has done a wonderful job of preserving locks and portions of the canal for visitors. We had a pretty large crew out there working to clean and then, of course, to document it. So here's just another view. You can see up the upper middle is our total station because we're mapping all of this. And here's the canal lock when it's fairly well cleaned. We were doing some probing, we were doing some excavations around it, but the lock itself, I mean, it's a ditch. It's a ditch with masonry. So there's not a lot of work one can do on the structure itself, apart from cleaning it up, taking measurements, mapping it. You see this sort of flat ground in here in the middle. This is all sediment that's filled in to the lock over the years. And one of the questions we had was, well, how deep is this sucker? Because supposedly it was fairly shallow, and that was a hindrance for carrying a lot of conventional canal boats, especially fully loaded. So we actually dug a hole in the middle of it. I don't quite know who that is with me, but that's my head in the ground, of course. Just digging sort of a large shovel test pit, and I don't have the information on hand, but it only went down a foot or so. So there's not a great deal of depth to this. We don't have a scale here, but if this fellow is 6 foot tall, it's this thing is maybe 8-10 feet at most. Add another foot, 11 feet. It wouldn't be completely filled with water. Say it would be 3 feet below the top. So not very deep. It would take, we need a real canal aficionado, somebody who's really familiar with the construction of these things to review our data and perhaps give us a better assessment. The walls curve. So we've got a 6 foot rule here, and they curve, and that's again to accommodate the gates and to give the canal boats a little room to nose into these things, because the locks are fairly narrow. Remember, they're not made for simultaneous two-way traffic. Just they didn't work that way. If you wanted two-way traffic, you built another set of locks right next to them. All those yellow bits of flagging tape that mark something, and I don't remember what. Some pretty good stonework, some good stone masonry. This is well constructed. Again, I'm not sure how well engineered it was. Construction was good, but again, to have locks that are a 9-degree angle to the canal seems awfully odd to me. But I'm not an engineer. And this short shovel here gives you a sense of the height we're talking about. That's maybe 3 foot long. Our map, again, a topographic map, and you can see where it all gets kind of squirrely in here. This is the canal locks right through here. And we did some excavations. We did some shovel testing. That's what these small open circles are about. The filled circles are those in which we recovered artifacts. But you can see each of these blue dotted ellipses, they mark possible structures. And we actually found foundations and whatnot. So there's a group of buildings around these locks that are probably comport with those we saw on one of those earlier maps. And these are just test excavations. There's a lot of archaeology that can be done here. We're just looking around, confirming that we've got buildings, getting a small sample of artifacts. But there's a good deal of work that could be done on this little community around the locks. And as far as I know, the land is still owned by Exelon, the power company, that, if I'm not mistaken, owns BGE. Here's one of those buildings we found. So we've got a stone foundation, lots of nails and all the hardware. I don't remember the size of this particular building offhand, but we did find several of these. And from an archaeological perspective, it's not like you have to move a lot of soil. These things are right at the surface. You can do a lot of the excavation with a whisk broom. We've got Ann Pearson reflecting on this. Ann, oh God, I don't remember her married name. She's the director over at the Laurel Factory House Museum in Laurel. But she and I pretty much were co-principal of this project. So she's been working here. Yeah, she's got some sort of metal artifact here. Maybe it's a barrel hoop. I wouldn't be surprised. Again, there's a lot more archaeology could be done here. A couple of the artifacts we found from in or around the locks. This is a mechanism on the left that probably was for opening up those flutter gates at the base of the downstream gates. That's what opened those flutter gates, allowed the water to empty out, and so the level of the water in the lock would drop as the canal boat made its way down slope. And another piece, some sort of hanger. This is done on Dan Coates' tiled floor, I think. Each of these tiles is probably about 5 inches on the side, just to give you some sense of scale. So here's an actual operating, an intact lock. It's not operating because the gates aren't there. I think this is the one at Havre de Grace on the Susquehanna Canal, the somewhat later one. But you can see there's a good deal of craftsmanship that went into these things. They're well built. I suspect the Susquehanna Canal, the later one, was better engineered, but then I've not made a study of it. This is Conowingo Dam. And again, you can drive across this thing today. It was finished in 1928, 1929, part of rural electrification. The impounded water upstream covered the north end of the Octoraro Canal, and also, as I recall, 3 villages. So there's a lot that's inundated under that reservoir. It's actually a problem nowadays because we've had sediment building up behind that dam for 100 years. And that sediment includes a lot of toxic material as well as trash and, of course, sediment. And it's been an issue for some years now, is how do we clean that out without buggering up the whole rest of the river and the Chesapeake Bay? Remember, the Chesapeake Bay is the Susquehanna River. It's just inundated over the last 3,000 years. Originates up around Cooperstown, central New York, flows down through New York, Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and eventually becomes the Chesapeake Bay. So we've got water from that large watershed and all the garbage that comes with it flowing in and then getting trapped behind the dam. This is a photo of it when it was under construction. So the dam is effectively not, it's still under construction here. But you can see the amount of land around it that was destroyed during construction. And again, that's what's taken out part of the Octoraro Canal. As promised, this is an image of an aqueduct. This is on the C&O Canal up at, I think that's Williamsport. And basically, it's a bridge. It's a bridge that carries water instead of a road. Actually, now it's a road. There's no water in it now. You can walk across it. But again, it's a fairly, significant engineering and construction project. And it even has some architectural detail. If you notice these pilasters here, done with sort of fake capitals. So they tried to kind of decorate it a little bit. But basically, it's a stone arch bridge that took the Canal over, I guess this is the Potomac River. I don't know if they're still doing it nowadays. Well, here you can see the one wall is gone. One parapet wall has collapsed in. So you can only see the one wall here. And this pavement here would have been the bottom of the aqueduct, the bottom of the canal, and is now used for Park Service vehicles and pedestrians. It used to be, well, here's canal basin. And these were important for the bigger canals because a canal boat didn't necessarily go the whole route from one end to the other, or if it did, even if it did at the termini, the canal boat would have to turn around, right? And so they had these canal basins, and that's what this is at Williamsport. The old brick and coal yard building is still there. Cush was. A closer view of it. Now, that would be an important facility to have on a canal because if you want to ship bricks that you've made in this area and coal down to cities like Baltimore, you'd bring it to a place like this, load it up on canal boats and send it down. And it'd be the same thing with the railroad. You've got to get this stuff onto some sort of vehicle that can carry heavy loads long distances. Used to be, and maybe they're doing this again after the plague, but every year they'd have the Basset Hound Wattle, the Basset Wattle, going down this part of the canal. So if you're ever there, I don't recall what time of the year it is, obviously a warm time of the year, but scores and scores of Basset Hounds. Just giving some charm to the place. Here you see, I think this is on the Chesapeake in Ohio, but you can see the remains of the gates here and these long levers that, again, you put your back to, literally, and push with your legs to open and close them. And I thought this is kind of an interesting picture because it shows canal boat meeting railroad. In this case, it's probably a short line that takes coal down to the canal boat. And I think that's what they're doing here is they basically have a shovel that's lifting the coal up and loading it on board the boat. But again, railroads outcompeted railroads. Railroads outcompeted canals because they didn't have to worry about water. They didn't have to worry about that kind of storm damage. When tracks are damaged, they're fairly easy to replace. Just as a side note, there's a report from World War II where economists are looking at the effects of the Allied bombing on German railroads. And this is done after the war. And the report was kept secret for a long time because the Air Force had a lot riding on this. But what they found was the Allied forces would bomb German railroads at night, and the Germans would have these fixed within hours the following day. So the report questioned the utility of doing that, of bombing just railroad tracks. Well, fixing a railroad track is relatively quick and easy. Fixing a canal is a very different thing. And so canal boats really died out by the beginning of the 20th century. They just couldn't compete with the rail lines, and the railroads could go any which way they wanted. They weren't reliant on courses of rivers. So railroads are part of this larger effort to improve transportation, which is really complicated in our country because, as people have noted over the years, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that authorizes the United States government to build large projects like this, to put money into it. The National Road was really the first effort that I'm aware of, the transportation infrastructure, and it was hotly contested. There were people who were saying the federal government had they weren't authorized to spend money on something like this. And the way the federal government got around it was they said, well, we need the national road to quickly move armed forces from Washington, from the federal capital, westward to Indian country. And that was the rationale for it. And National Road exists today. Part of it, lots of, there are a couple of roads that have succeeded it, but parts of National Road survive. You can drive it. There's some interesting historic sites along the way. But that was built around the same time, early 19th century. It's at the same time canals were kind of kicking into gear. They were very popular in the UK for a long time before they really took off in this country. And they really get going in the 1790s. They were built up through the mid-19th century, at which point I think it was pretty clear to everybody that the railroads were far more efficient. We have steamboat systems that started in the 1830s and ran to early 1930s with a combination of automobile traffic and the Great Depression pretty much put an end to them. But a lot of Southern Maryland was connected to Washington and Baltimore by way of regular steamboat, scheduled steamboat travel. Railroads, they start around the 1840s, pretty much after the mid-20th century. Highways, particularly with the interstate highway system, really superseded railroads for the most part. I mean, it's still big in this country. It still move a lot of freight. A lot of it is cross-country. It's not unusual to see a train that's literally 2 miles long. For those of you who've traveled out west, you've probably been interrupted in your travels by waiting for 2 miles of railroad to go very slowly across the crossing that you're on. State road systems, at least in Maryland, begin in the 1920s. We get this State Roads Commission, eventually becomes the State Highway Administration. And in the 1950s, we're building roads like crazy at the state level and the interstate highway system in the 1950s. So, I mean, the bottom line of all this is that canals played an important but very brief part in the transportation history of the country. They started moving almost all sorts of produce, and as railroads became more common, they started carrying more high bulk, low value material like coal. And I have the question, what's next? First of all, very little archaeology has been done on most of this. There's been some excavations along the National Road. There's been some archaeology mostly along the C&O Canal by National Park Service. I don't know of any archaeology that's been done on steamboat landings on the East Coast. I've done a little bit of archaeology on railroads, and I've talked about that, I think, earlier this year. But the question is, well, what's next? What's our next great venture? And one of the things, of course, is the maglev, the electromagnetic system for railroads that moves them at very high speeds. There's still one on the drawing boards for Maryland. They've been used in Japan. They move at incredible speeds at very little cost in terms of fuel, because it's all electricity and electromagnetics. What else is coming down the line? I don't know. The Jetsons with their, everybody has their own little hovercraft or something. I don't know. But we can see that there's still this combination, this odd mix of government funding and private ventures to make these transportation networks, which for a lot of our history made them very disjointed. Each canal was a corporation unto itself, each railroad a corporation. A lot of the early turnpikes were privately owned, and they would run into publicly owned roads. So a real mishmash of private and public investment. Nowadays, we seem to be doing that more in partnership rather than having separate ventures. At any rate, it's something for discussion in the political world. And just a sort of a downbeat epilogue to the Octoraro and Maryland Canal, the locks at Octoraro were considered to be not eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. This is a decision made by the Maryland Historical Trust on the basis of a private consulting firm that said, well, most of the canal is gone. Um, I don't know, it seemed pretty weak argument to me. There are three wonderful locks there, and there's a bunch of archaeology around them. It seems to me the Maryland Historical Trust should revisit this decision. Not that I expect them to do so. Anyway, that's all I have for this evening. So I'm happy to entertain questions.
It was interesting that you mentioned X, Jim, because I was reading in the Wall Street Journal the other day about a company in Dayton called Joby's. And basically what they're doing is personal aircraft, and they call it flying cars a la the Jetsons.
You know, it could well happen in our lifetimes. And, I know I'm going to be around for another 100 years. You guys won't be around quite as long, but still within your lifetimes, we could see stuff like that. The self-driving cars, for the last several years, been almost a joke, a punchline. Well, they're self-driving taxi services now we're experimenting with in I think Phoenix or Tucson, no, somewhere in the southwest, and San Francisco. These changes, when they happen fast. So who knows?
I remember watching when I was a kid. They used to do one of these Sunday afternoon news shows. Dave Garroway hosted it, and they featured, this is like back in the late 50s, maybe early 60s, self-driving cars based on sensors in the road.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. And also, for those of you, if you watch Turner Classic Movies on television, in between films, they often have these shorts. And lately, they've been doing a series of these sort of short news things from mostly the 1960s. And one they've had on recently was about, who knows, in 30 years, there may be self-driving cars. I don't remember exactly. I mean, they're talking about automobiles. I know that, and so they were a bit optimistic. It's more like 50 years, but yeah, happening.
I took a boat cruise up the Rhone River, and they still have locks on that river, and it was pretty exciting to be able to stand on the bow of the boat as the lock was filling and the boat was rising and then moving on. It was very cool.
Yeah. They've got some big locks along there too. Sometimes they can have two boats going in at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, those are large locks. And I think they may have had some of those along the Erie Canal, but along the canals down here, I think they were really short ones. Yeah, I've been on a canal boat at Great Falls. I don't recall us going through a lock though. It was just sort of National Park Service kind of paddling.
Yeah, they do that. They do a mile on the, I've done that too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of fun. It's very restful. It gives you a little bit of a sense of what it was like. But
I never thought I'd be on a boat cruise until my father talked me into a river cruise. I recommend it. It's very calm. It's fun. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from many different sources, it's pretty clear that riding the canals was not, I mean, initially when they first opened, it was probably quite nice. But these were, a lot of dilapidated structures, dirty, dilapidated boats, rather coarse men, running these canal boats. It probably wasn't that pleasant an experience, as opposed to now when we do it for jollies. One of the SEAL team members, Linda, just did a trip from the Great Lakes down the eastern coast, going by way of canal. And I think she took the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal as well, and like a motorboat. But these are incredible networks. They were really big in the UK. There was a real craze over them. People invested in them. Some people made a lot of money. A lot of people lost a lot of money. But it was quite the craze. And it took a long time to take off in this country because it required a lot of capital. It assumed that there was somewhere to go with the canal, because out west is still a lot of, it was undeveloped farmland for the most part, and it's just beginning to come under the plow. And so having enough farms producing enough material in a several places along the course of the canal. You had to wait for that to happen before it was worth building the canal. But there were all kinds of folks who invested in it. George Washington was a big investor, and he died in 1799. I think portions of the Potomac Canal had opened just before he died.
Jim, I forget the portage between the Erie Canal and the Hudson River. There was a big falls there. How did they get stuff from the Mohawk / Erie Canal into the Hudson?
Well, I don't, I haven't looked at that part of the canal, but presumably there were a series of locks that took the canal from running along the Mohawk River down to the Hudson. I mean, getting around the falls at the fall line, which runs all the way down the East Coast, all the major cities are located on that fall line.
Right.
Including Baltimore, Washington, and Richmond. And so it was at that point, notice those cities were put at the fall line because it gave them water access to the ocean, but at the same time shortened the distance to the interior where most of the produce was produced. That's where all the farmland was. And the same thing with the earlier towns. They were put as far up navigable rivers as they could so they can, grab that interior produce. But you needed some way of getting around that fall line, and canals were, the logical solution to the problems.
Were there any in Anne Arundel County?
There was a proposed canal from Washington, D.C. to Annapolis.
Oh.
The engineer for the Drum Point Railroad, he's telling the General Assembly about his bona fides, why he should be the engineer planning the Drum Point Railroad, was in 1868, was that he spent a lot of time in the area and he helped direct the survey for the canal that would run from Washington, D.C. to Annapolis. Now, obviously, they never built that. And I'm unaware of any drawings, any engineering reports that survived, but it'd be worth looking into. That's pretty, anybody who knows Anne Arundel County, a canal.
Yeah.
It's not, and a canal leading into Annapolis of all places where the water's kind of shallow. I mean, Annapolis never took off. After the 18th century, the water was too shallow for large ocean-going vessels. Baltimore is where it was at. So the idea of running a canal to Annapolis seemed a little strange anyway. Any other questions, comments, or criticisms? No? Okay, well, it's just about 8 o'clock anyway. So again, next, we're talking about brick making, and I assure you it's much more interesting than it sounds. It really gives you a sense of how these structures were built and what was the investment that was made, and how you can actually look at bricks that you find and you can get some idea what they date to and how they were made. And then in November, it's going to be about the Westwood archaeological site, which dates back about 5,000 years. And it's a really interesting site, Native American site. Anyway, thank you for joining.